Now, there's another one, though, that is very common that he brings up, and in fact devotes quite a bit of room to it. And here it is, and I'm quoting from his piece. Perhaps even more compelling is the story of Christ himself. As it turns out, it's not even remotely original. It is instead nothing more than a collection of bits and pieces from dozens of other stories that came long before. Here are some examples. Then he gives these examples. I'm not going to go read them all. I suspect many of you have heard this kind of claim in the past. He cites Hercules, he cites Dionysus, he cites Osiris and Horus and Mithras, and here you have and Krishna and Buddha and Apollonius. And so you have these different individuals from Greek and Far Eastern mythologies and Roman pagan religions and an Egyptian religion. All of these different individuals turn out to have these kinds of characteristics littered through their mythologies that also show up in the life of Jesus. All right? And again, I'm not going to go through all the details because I don't have time for that. I've done that in other places. In fact, you can go to our website and you could look up Recycled Redeemer. That's the piece I wrote dealing with this to see my response to that. Lee Strobel has a book called "Making the Case" or "The Case for the Historical Jesus," and there's quite a bit that's written about this particular issue. So much written that I'm amazed that people are still raising this canard, and it is a canard. That it is an empty claim, and it is faulted on a number of different grounds. And let me just kind of offer them to you briefly. Here's the first grounds on which this very popular claim is faulted. Hardly anything that it says about the ancient mythologies, whether it's Dionysus or Osiris, Horus, Mithras, Buddha, Krishna, whatever, hardly anything of those details that seem to match the details of the life of Christ can be found in the primary source documentation. What ends up happening is you got a bunch of people on the internet quoting each other in circles. When you go back to the primary source documentation, you realize that these so-called facts are not facts at all. They simply do not show up there. The real academics know this, by the way. Now, there are some details that seem to look like Jesus. I admit that. Guess what? Those are from Mithras. Mithras is an individual from a Roman mystery religion. We don't have any texts on Mithras. We have bits and pieces and shards and stuff like that give us some information, but all the bits and pieces and shards that we have to describe the Mithras cult that predates Christ are all things that come a couple hundred years after Jesus. Did you catch that? So in other words, the things that sound more like Jesus actually were written after Jesus, which means it's likely that the Mithras cult or the details of the Mithras cult were copied from the real life of Jesus and not the other way around. Now, all this to say is you can't, on archaeological or literary grounds alone, you can't disqualify the life of Jesus because of these alleged similarities. That's the first point. But there's another point that is more, I think, damning than what I've noted so far, and that is this. The first time that I heard this argument came from Michael Shermer, who was debating Doug Geivett in Southern California at Rocky Peak Church. And I was in the audience, and I heard Michael Shermer, who I have since debated, offer this, what I called recycled redeemer, way of undermining the legitimacy of the gospel accounts of Jesus' life. And I immediately realized that he had just made a significant logical blunder. What's the logical blunder? Well, let me characterize it this way. I didn't do this, but I might have walked up to Michael Shermer and said to him, Michael Shermer, yeah, you're Michael Shermer. Yeah, no, you're not. Yes, I am. No, you're not. Why would you say I'm not Michael Shermer? Because, I say, in the last 6 months, I have met 5 different people who claim to be the Professor Michael Shermer from Occidental College who wrote these particular books, and they weren't him. Therefore, you couldn't be him either. Now, of course, you see the problem there, right? Just because there were phonies that came before doesn't mean you don't have the real McCoy right in front of you. That's bad thinking. Now, how might the real Michael Shermer convince me, the skeptic who had heard Michael Shermer's stories, mythologies, before this man claimed to be Michael Shermer, how might the real Michael Shermer verify that he is the person who he claimed to be, even though there were phonies that came before him? What do you think? If you were Michael Shermer, what would you do? Maybe dig into your pocket and pull out a what? Driver's license. Here are my bona fides. I'm the real guy. I don't know about those other guys before me, but here's what I know. I'm the real deal, and here's the evidence for it. Entirely right. You cannot disqualify the claims of one person to be whatever simply because you do have good evidence, even if you do have good evidence of someone coming before them that made the same kind of claims. So here's what I'm saying about all of these mythologies before Jesus. I have already said that they don't really match up very closely to the specifics of the life of Jesus. But even if they did, and they matched line for line for line, it would not disqualify the Gospels as being accurate accounts of the life of Jesus. It might raise an eyebrow. Another one? But it can't disqualify it. C.S. Lewis said, first you have to demonstrate that a person is mistaken before it's reasonable to ask why he is mistaken. He called that bulverism, that mistake of presuming they're mistaken and then trying to construct a rationale of how the mistake happened. First, you got to prove the mistake. So what would be Jesus' bona fides? Well, Jesus' bona fides would be the Gospels themselves, the accounts or the alleged accounts of his life. So we look at the alleged accounts of his life to see if they have substance from an historical perspective, if we have good reasons to believe that these things actually took place largely as described in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the primary source documentation. And indeed, this is exactly what scholars do all the time. The most the most widely circulated book on history in history, the Pulitzer Prize-winning story of civilization, Will and Ariel Durant, has one whole volume titled Caesar and the Christ. He wasn't getting this from a bunch of make-me-up. He's an historian. And just like all the rest of them that cite details of Jesus' life, they are drawing from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as reliable historical sources. Now, that doesn't mean that they believe everything in it. They don't go for the miracles, etc. I understand that. But that does mean that on balance, they consider them historically reliable and not just a collection of mythology. And if they prove themselves on the merits, standing alone, to be historically reliable, it does not matter what came before them or how accurate, or how much of a comparison lineup, item for item, correlation there is between the ancient mythologies and the life of Jesus. If the life of Jesus is well attested to historically by standard historical critical methods, then it doesn't matter. Okay, now I'm going to offer you the coup de grace for this particular point. And what I'm going to read to you is actually out of this wonderful book called The Story of Reality. That has a familiar ring to it. But it's just faster to read it than try to explain it, because it's a very powerful point in this regard. All right, so let me read this to you. This is what I'm about to offer is true. In fact, the book that I make reference to here, I actually own. Here's what it says under the chapter, I think 16. Yeah, History, chapter titled History. In 1898, a man named Morgan Robertson published a novel titled Futility. The story was a fictional account about a transatlantic voyage of a cruise ship traveling between England and New York. The ship was massive, the largest vessel afloat, and it was considered indestructible. Even so, in the middle of the night in April, with 3 massive propellers driving the ship forward, the unsinkable ship collided with an iceberg and sank to the bottom of the ocean. Because the number of lifeboats on the ship was half of what was needed for its capacity, more than half of its passengers perished. The ship was called the Titan. Now that is the fiction. Here is the fact. 14 years after Robertson published Futility, which, as an aside, the book is now called The Wreck of the Titan, so it's been re-released with a different title. Original title was Futility. But 14 years after Robertson published Futility, the world's largest luxury liner, the indestructible Titanic, departed from England on a transatlantic voyage to New York in April. In the middle of the night, the Titanic's triple screws drove the ship into an iceberg, and it sank to the bottom of the ocean. Since the Titanic was fitted with less than half the number of lifeboats needed for its capacity, more than half of its passengers were lost. Now, you're thinking, man, that is one amazing coincidence, and I agree with you. It's phenomenal, but I'm not making this up. I own the book. You can go online and read all about it. These kinds of things actually happen. And this coincidence makes a point, which I make here as I continue reading the next paragraph. This real-life coincidence teaches us a crucial lesson I do not want you to miss. Regardless of the similarities between 2 accounts of different events, the second cannot simply be dismissed as fabrication merely because the first was a fiction. Whether or not the details of the Titanic's disaster are accurate can only be determined by its own evidence. You can speculate all you like about similarities with the ill-fated fictional Titan 14 years earlier, but that will get you nowhere, since it tells you nothing about the reliability of newspaper reports describing the Titanic's demise on April 15th, 1912.